All right, guys, I want to welcome everyone here tonight. I want to thank everybody who came. Is there anyone elected officials you'd like to stand up and introduce yourself? Yes.
I'm Ted Combs, Londonderry Budget Committee Chairman.
I'm Lisa Whittemore, Londonderry State Rep.
Betsy McKinney, also a Londonderry State Rep.
Thank you.
That was that.
Greg Warner on the Budget Committee.
Annie Warner, Supervisor of the Checkbook.
Yay. Charlie.
Oh, I
Derek
thought you were
Sherritt.
just introducing
Just
the
if you're
elected
an
officials.
elected official. Yeah, you are an elected official.
Oh, elected official by the Derry Democrats.
Sorry,
I'm chair of the
I
Derry
was
Democrats.
We'll take that.
We'll take
I'm
that.
also elected library trustee
Right.
Oh, that counts.
Yes,
Hey, it takes a
by
village.
the whole community.
As you know, we're here to talk about big money in politics tonight. Thank you, Mark, for coming. I want to say a little bit about Kevin. He and I have gotten to know each other very well, and he's probably one of the most nonpartisan guys I've talked to in a long time when it comes to government. He's lived in Londonderry, met his wife in Londonderry. I want to make sure I get their names right. Susie, he married Susie, and they have 3 kids. It's Lindsay, Colby, and Thomas. Their son Russell with our grandkids, and so it's really nice to see a good communal thing going on here with the town. And I can't tell you how much he's done for getting businesses in town and just really working with the development. So I want to introduce you, Kevin, and thank you for having us.
Oh, thank you, Tammy. Thanks. I didn't charge Tammy too much to say. But welcome everyone to Town Hall. And in case you're not familiar with who I am, Kevin Smith, I'm the town manager here in Londonderry. And although this is not a town-sponsored event, we welcome and encourage residents in the community to host these kinds of informational community forums. So I'm pleased to see such a good crowd here tonight to listen to Mark. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, who is Mark Connolly. If you're not familiar with Mark, he is the former Deputy Secretary of State for New Hampshire. He also served as the Director for the Bureau of Security Regulations and worked on a number of high-profile cases here in the state, perhaps the biggest one being the FRM Ponzi scheme back in 2010, I believe, Mark, right? Having watched that closely personally, I felt that Mark was a straight shooter throughout that whole ordeal and really did the state quite a service in exposing a lot of the systematic failures throughout multiple agencies in state government. So I thank you for your work on that, Mark. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much of his time, so with that, let me introduce to you Mark Connolly.
Thank you. Get the right feel here to face you. Anyway, good to be here. And let me just say, Tammy and Kevin, thanks for putting this on. And I just want to take a moment, since Kevin was such a nice introduction. I am a Democrat. Kevin's a Republican. I have to tell you, when he ran for governor, I was very impressed with some of the ideas that he espoused about economic development. I can see in Londonderry a lot of good stuff coming here, and it's very impressive, the opportunities that Londonderry has. So I just wanted to say thank you, Kevin, for your service, and you're still a young man, so there's time for you. So I feel like I'm competing tonight with either Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity, so hopefully we'll bring a little more of a conciliating a tenor to the subject, which is very serious, but I think important, and that is the outsized influence of money in our political debate today. And I'll talk a little bit about why I'm doing this, but I thought I would start with a little story. And that is, and I just read this recently, I think it's a really timely story to say this. In 1787, at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin was 87 years old. He was the oldest delegate. And the proceedings were actually held in secrecy because of the nature of the debates at that time. And on the very last day, he was very old, and he would die shortly thereafter. He was carried out, and a woman came up to him and said, "Dr. Franklin, what have you done here today? Is it a republic or a monarchy?" And Franklin said, and you can just picture it with the little glasses he used to have and the long, white hair and his beaver coat. He reached over and quickly said to her, "Madam, it's a republic. See if you can keep it." And that's interesting because that comment was transcribed by another fellow delegate, and it wasn't found until about 100 years ago. And when I read it, to me, it really says we just brought forward the Constitution of the United States, Declaration of Independence, but it's really up to the people, not necessarily the document, the people to make sure that we do have a republic. That last day, he gave his last public speech, and he said, and one quote I have to read to you, and I wrote it down here, but he also said in the speech that if we don't work together as a republic, then we will be in a point where we'll become a despot. We could be ruled by a despot. And at that time, you'll know, that was a monarchy or a king. You can make the argument today that if you have outsized influence of money in our politics today, we could veer into really what I think what's going on now. We yell at each other. We think our position is right. And Franklin, in that speech, said this. I may need my glasses like he did, but he said, "I don't know how it happens, but I never met anyone but myself that's always right." Now, the context of that comment was he was reflecting on him being an 87-year-old man and saying, you know what, I realized when I was a young man that I really didn't know everything. And he said, I voted for this Constitution knowing that I didn't support everything in it when I came here, but it really is about coming together, progressive, conservative, whatever you say at that time, and trying to work through common issues. And that's the strength of a republic. And I think if we don't grapple with this subject of money and how it's dividing us, we really could go in a direction that is against what Franklin and our forefathers were talking about. As Kevin said, I was Director of Securities Regulation from 2002 to 2010. I actually grew up pretty close to here. I grew up in Bedford. And I've spent the last 25 years of my life in public service, 8 years, and the rest in the financial service industry. And in 2002, I was asked to take over this job. And my background was very different than most regulators because I had a business background. Most regulators are attorneys. And I went into it thinking I'm going to stay a couple of years because, actually, to tell you the truth, my mother was very ill and she was dying, and I thought it'd give me a chance to spend time with her. And when I got to this position, I realized the office really needed to be overhauled, needed a lot of work. But the very first month I was there, I got a phone call from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and they were investigating Dennis Kozlowski. You might remember Tyco. And they asked if we would get involved, and you may or may not know this, but Tyco was really headquartered here. A lot of the people who perpetrated the shower curtains and everything you heard about were here. But I flew down to New York, and I saw the evidence that they had. They had arrested Dennis Kozlowski, and I was amazed at the literal fleecing of this corporation. I returned back to New Hampshire, and we filed a subpoena for documents. And that was my first, and maybe because I really wasn't a regulator, that was my first introduction to the reality of politics, because I got phone calls asking, New Hampshire doesn't do this kind of thing, what are you doing? And I had to have some meetings with the Attorney General's office and say, you know what, the subpoena's out there, we're going forward. And that unleashed a battle, if you will, for 6 months. And we actually dealt with the David Boyce law firm in New York, who represented, Al Gore in the Bush-Gore 2000 presidential election. And what the Boyce law firm wanted us to do was to look at these perpetrators because they knew it was so bad. So they gave us these documents that led us to say, wow, this is bad. But then we said, how did the board allow this to happen? And that's not where they wanted us to go. So not to run you through the whole case, but we signed an agreement for securities fraud in November of 2002, and it was the second largest securities settlement in the nation's history to that point. Now, it's amazing when you look at $5 million because the settlements now are in the billions, and that's indicative of where we're coming as a nation. When we signed the agreement, when we issued the subpoena, I should say, I called the Securities Exchange Commission for help because we had a 10-person office, and going up against the major law firms was going to be tough. And the Securities Exchange Commission, the member I got hold of, said to me, we don't do corporate governance. Companies are the creatures of the states. Now, in 2002, you might remember this thing called Sarbanes-Oxley. That was the first time the federal government actually had the ability to go after corporate boards for malfeasance. It's hard to believe, and I was shocked to find that. To get back to Tyco, not only do we have a record settlement, but we were the first regulator, I believe, to ever take action against an American corporation for fraud. And Tyco had to in order for us to have a settlement, they had to redo their ethics. They had to put all their employees through an ethics training, and they had to go through that for 5 years after that. I was very proud of that achievement because we had a very small staff. But after that, and I'm going to kind of brag on our bureau, we actually, over an 8-year period, went after ING, UBS, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, and brought in some $50 million in securities fines and settlements. And in 2007, we were given a national award by all our fellow regulators for our achievement. And that was unusual because we're a small state, as you know. Now, beyond the bragging part, I will tell you that one thing I found in that experience is that I knew, because of my business experience, that the markets often work with a wink and a nod. But I didn't realize that the system had failed us because not only of greed run amok, but also that our regulators weren't doing their job. They lacked the regulatory will. So I tell you, there are a lot of great regulators in our country, but what happens to many of the regulatory process, it becomes inundated by politics. And let's go back to 2000 to 2002. And what we find is that the markets melted down more so than any other period since the Great Depression. And we had Enron, Adelphia, WorldCom, it goes on and on. We had backdating of stock options for corporate executives. We had mutual funds that allowed late trading in their funds, which was illegal. And you would think that we'd learn a lot from that. We passed this big bill called Sarbanes-Oxley. And then some 5 years later, we have the literal meltdown almost of the world economy. Now, have any of you heard of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF? Okay, it's a organization that provides lending and economic assistance to countries that need it. In 2010, they commissioned a study, and they brought in 3 economists, and their charge was, why did this happen? Why did the world economy almost blow up? And they released a study a year later, and they called it a fistful of dollars. And they said that even the United States is a relatively small country in terms of population, we control the financial markets of this world. And the reason the credit meltdown happened was because there was so much political influence on regulators not to do their job. And it's pointed out there were 30 pieces of legislation that were introduced in a 5-year period to roll back the mortgage problem. Predatory loans, no document loans, robo-signing, giving loans to people who should not have been given loans. So what really transpired there? In a 10-year period, we had 2 major financial crises, one of which almost brought the world economy down. And the conclusion by these economists was the United States lobbying pressure and campaign contributions that go to the politicians who influence the lobbyists is putting the world economy at risk. That's scary. Now, when you go back in the last, let's say, 30 years, the United States has experienced some kind of form of financial crisis, usually every 6 to 10 years. If you remember in the 1980s, we had the savings and loan bailout, $150 billion. We had several investment banks go under. I'm trying to think of the big one.
Silverado?
No, yeah, Silverado was part of the savings and loan debacle. Anyway, we went through long-term capital management was the first hedge fund. It was a bailout by the federal government and banks in the late 1990s. We had Enron, which really is the biggest Ponzi scheme in American history when you think about it. Anyway, the point I'm making is the common denominator of all of these crises is that we had too much greed and lack of regulatory control that was influenced by the political process. So that's the framework in which I'd like to talk tonight. So where are we right now? At the height of the economic crisis in 2008, this is what happened. We had $3.5 billion being spent by lobbyists in Washington in getting people elected. Some 14,000 lobbyists in Washington. Now think of that. and almost $500 million, if not more, were in the financial industry. Is there any doubt in your mind how this is all working? And where does all that lead us to? If you look at the 2012 election, some $6 billion was spent in that presidential campaign. And it's estimated that $1.5 billion of that is from these things called super PACs you've heard of, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And that super PAC money, they estimate 35% of all the ads you saw were from monies that that can't be accounted for, because when we're going through all of the lack of regulatory will, all of the political shenanigans, the Supreme Court in 2010, by a 5-4 decision, said that we're going to take off all kinds of restrictions on monies by corporations and unions, and that is what's really led to the acceleration of the problem today. It now costs some $1.6 million to run for Congress, and that's not the super PAC money. That's just you have to come up with, and $10 million to run for the United States Senate. In 1998, that number was $1 million for Congress and $5 million for the Senate. Just see that trend in what it represents. So we just went through this major economic crisis, fistful of dollars. We lost estimated $16 trillion in economic output in this country between 2007 and 9. Think about it, that's the GDP of this country. We're now somewhat 5 years after the blow up, and we know what the economy is. It's slowly getting better, but we still don't have the robustness that we need to go forward. We've lost all of that momentum. And what's happening now? Well, this is what's happened. The banks that put us in this position, they are bigger today than they were in 2007. 0.2% of the banks in this country control 2/3 of the assets of the assets of this country in general. And we have now codified into law too big to fail. And the derivatives market, you've heard about these. They're just a bet one way or the other between a buyer and seller. They're bigger today than they were in 2007. And the banks have found ways, even we have this Dodd-Frank, to keep on doing it. So we made changes on the margin, yes, and I support a lot of it. But in fact, instead of making too big to fail, attracting that, we've now said too small to succeed, because the banks today, the bigger banks are actually, and I kid you not, by the fact that we have codified too big to fail, these large banks, their cost of funding to put out loans and their capital position, it's an estimated $100 billion a year in terms of a subsidy from the federal government, because they can charge less. So that's where we are today. There is too much lobbying control, and let me put another fact in front of you that's scary when I tell people this. 1.5 million Americans gave $200 or less to one of the presidential candidates in 2012. Only 60 Americans gave the same amount of money to a super PAC, 4.6 million each. Now that trend is continuing. So let me back off and tell you about New Hampshire. As Kevin alluded to, there was a Ponzi scheme in 2009. It was called Financial Resources Mortgage Company, FRM. And at that time in my career, I was actually on the way out. I was thinking of leaving, going back to my private practice. And when it blew up, I was asked to come to meetings, and the thrust of the meetings were these. It's commercial mortgages. The state really doesn't handle commercial mortgages, so the state's not responsible. And maybe you'll take some responsibility, the banking will take some responsibility, and the AGs will take responsibility. So nobody gets responsibility. And I said no. And I did the same thing that I did in 2002, and I issued a subpoena to the banking department. It's crazy when you think about it. And one agency subpoenaing another for documents, because the banking department's saying, but not this, and they're the regulator, won't give anybody the documents to see what really went on here. FRM, without getting into the details, to me is symbolic of what's wrong with our nation in general. It happened because too few regulators are not doing their job, and outside political influence. Some 300 lobbyists exist in Concord today, and they are embedded in our political campaigns. It costs $150,000 to run for the state senate, as people will tell you. So lobbies bundle money from their clients and give it out. We don't know really where it came from. In 2012, I was telling Kevin, we have the dubious distinction, have the most out-of-state super PAC money per voter than any other state in the country. $25 million is spent in our gubernatorial election, 20+ million. What we know of came from super PACs. And our state law today says, and this will surprise you, we do not require disclosure of these people coming into our state. And the same thing is true in Washington. Lawyers have figured out a way to cobble together different ways not to disclose who's giving the money. So what went wrong with corporate America? Lack of disclosure, lack of transparency, lack of accountability. What is happening today that's literally impacting all of our lives? What's happening is that too many lobbyists, too much money, driving the end result that if we don't change the path we're on, it's not if, it's when we'll have another financial crisis. And given the amount of debt and bailouts that we've had to do in the last several years, it's questionable we're able to do the same thing again. So what is the answer? Because I'm sure I've frustrated you all because people say, well, what do I do? I've been out, and I mentioned to Kevin, I did think about running for governor in 2012, and I decided not to do it, in part, because this issue is bipartisan, and it should be. If we don't fix it, I mean, we can sit and we can, I can give you a debate of the day, and a Republican can give me the debate of the day, and you know what? It's all relative. But if we don't have an equal playing field, we're going to be yelling at each other and become more and more divisive and not really solve the major problems facing this country. I'm joined in an association called New Hampshire Rebellion, and it's bipartisan. They march, you might have heard this, from Dixville Notch to Nashua in January of all times. And they're marching again on July. Yeah, it's a New Hampshire thing. I know. They're marching in July 5th in the Seacoast, 18 miles. You don't have to do the whole thing. You can do some of it. But the theme is we have the first in the nation presidential primary. And both parties are doing the same thing. So let's go to the parties and say, okay, enough. We've had enough. Let's call attention to this. So what can we do? 16 states, New Hampshire not being one of them, by the way, have asked the Congress to basically overturn Citizens United. It takes 34 states. Why do we want to do that? Because a corporation, if you will, is not a person, in my judgment. And we can debate that if you'd like. But no matter if you agree with that or not, the unlimited money they're allowed now in a Citizens United case is just corrupting and polluting our system. Beyond that, change in the Constitution, which, by the way, the United States has had its 32 amendments, so it's not unusual to do. And typically when the states get to 20 or 22 or 25, Congress does freak out, and they decide to put out an amendment the states can then adopt because they're afraid that if they go to 34, they actually have a constitutional convention, and the Congress does not want to do that, believe me. So that is one thing we can do to bring attention to the problem. The other is when you talk to your candidates, both sides, for Congress or the Senate, these are the things you should know going on today. Lobbyists can go to a member of a committee and they can bundle money and give them money on that committee. Shouldn't there be a prohibition that anybody getting something from a congressional committee should not be giving money to a member of that committee? Shouldn't we be saying they can't bundle money from all these different groups and give it to that member of the committee? Here's a scary thing. In Dodd-Frank, you've heard of that. One of the provisions was that if banks are going to engage in these bets, these derivative trades, which Warren Buffett has called weapons of financial mass destruction, by the way, and it's bigger today, as I mentioned, than it was then. The Dodd-Frank said we're going to carve that out so they cannot have access to federal protection, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC. Last year, a committee of Congress voted to let them come back in that protection. Now, why am I telling you that? Because it was shown that the people who voted for that on that committee got 7.5 times more from the financial industry in contributions than the people who didn't vote for it. Today, when you get elected to Congress, they tell you have to spend 30 to 70% of your time on the phone, 4 hours a day, raising money. Wouldn't it be nice to have a law that says if you're elected to Congress, during the hours of operation, you're not allowed to fundraise? I mean, those simple things. And if we have all these super PAC money pouring $1.5 billion into the 2012 election, can you imagine what's coming at us in 2016? Wouldn't it be nice to say anybody who gives any money into our political campaigns has to disclose that? Now, this is not big lift stuff. The reason it's not happening, it makes sense, it's logical, it's because once you get there, and you become part of the problem. 8% of the United States said they feel confident in Congress. 8%, that's a historic low. But we elect 91% of them. I mean, that's a fact. And the reason is because of the amount of money. So I'm going to leave you there, but I just want to say that, go back to Benjamin Franklin. It's not a static document. We all take responsibility for our democracy. And if we don't wake up and realize that we are being manipulated and we're being told how to think, and by the way, the more you divide people, the easier it is to raise money. If we don't take control of that, I think our very way of democracy is under threat. So anybody have any questions to that? Yeah, campaign finance law is very complicated. There's been 2 Supreme Court decisions, Citizen United being one. I believe the other one was McCulloch. And the Supreme Court has not yet addressed or taken off the restriction on giving money, capping the amount of money you can give to a candidate. For a federal candidate today, I believe it's $2,600. I might add, in New Hampshire law, before you run for governor or state senate, you can give $5,000 to a candidate. And the way the law reads now is a person who owns several corporations, each one of those corporations can give $5,000. I mean, the point is, the system, the contribution limit is not the problem. The problem is Citizens United said that unlimited amount of monies can go to these super PACs. And Congress on 2 occasions, I believe, have said, okay, let's put a cap of 10,000. So if you give 10,000 more, you have to disclose your donors. We can't even get that through. So whether it's 5,000, 10,000, putting aside whether corporations should be able to give unlimited funds from their corporate treasuries, should there be a cap? I believe there should. And here's something else. Under Dodd-Frank, the bill instructed the SEC to say that if a corporation is giving money out to candidates, whoever they may be, shouldn't the shareholders be aware of that? Shouldn't they be aware that their monies are going to the political process? And that's been fought by the industry. In fact, unfortunately, 4 years later, and I'm getting off tangent here, but 4 years later, after Dodd-Frank was adopted, only half of it has been put into play. And a lot of it is because of what I talked about earlier, all of this money, all this lobbying influence going towards the regulatory process. And unfortunately, if you're a regulator, think about this, if you're a federal regulator, and the Congress has the purse strings, you see what's coming at you if in political pressure, if you don't do basically what industry wants. And what I didn't talk about earlier, I'll tell you right now, a lot of regulators see being a regulator as a revolving door. I mean, they go right from being a regulator right to the industry. They call it punching the ticket. And the same thing happens in Congress. 50% of all U.S. senators become lobbyists. 50%, and 45% of congressmen become lobbyists. Their salary on average goes up 1,500%. And there's no restriction right now.
But they have a pretty good salary to start with.
They have a very good salary to start with. And there's no restriction now that says if you're a member of Congress that you cannot be soliciting jobs and actually accept a job without disclosing that. And here's one that I say to people, and they're shocked. Do you realize that if you are in a corporation today and you take a job with the federal government, a high-level executive job or staff job in the Senate, some companies will actually bonus you on how high up you go in that government appointment. I kid you not. We have a revolving door and we have a reverse revolving door. The provisions now are that you cannot be a lobbyist if you are a senator, I believe, for 2 years. I think 1 year and 2 years for the House, I believe. Why not make it 5 years? And why not say that the law is the way there, that it's such a big hole you can drive a Mack truck through? Why not say that you can't even be a special advisor, right? In other words, this is part of the insidious process. You get in, you need to raise money, and then when you lose or you've had enough, you then cash in the chips. And who is to lose here? It's the voters. So yes, we need disclosure, both the state level and the federal level. And I think part of the problem is that the system doesn't want to do that. And it's going to take more and more pressure from people like yourselves. Oh, I'm sorry, okay. The question was, excuse me if I misstated, there's been attempts to have disclosure, and what's the dollar amount that we should, have? And I put out the thought that we can come up with a number that's 5,000 or 10,000. Right now, it's unlimited. To go back to my example, 61 people gave on average $4.6 million, which equaled all the money by 1.5 million Americans who gave any of the presidential candidates. That's a scary statistic. So that exists also on the state level. We don't know, we're not even sure of the 20 million that went to the gubernatorial campaign or any of the other campaigns, who's funding it. We just don't know. Lisa? I can repeat it.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for that. I've been a state rep for 2 years now, and one of the problems we face in the state of New Hampshire is adequate funding for the absolute necessities of governance. And so as you're describing this problem at the federal level, I see it played out on a couple of different levels. We had massive deregulation starting in the 1980s, and President Reagan said, I think after his terms in office, there are no good people left in government. If they were any good, business would have hired them out. So you're having the hollowing out of agencies, which at the time had a tremendous brain trust. Your regulatory brain trust during the early 1980s was very powerful. As those agencies get defunded and professionals get replaced by political appointments, you now have people with less investment in the actual letter of the law. You've gone from people who have helped to write the regulations to people whose friends are not interested in the regulations. So you're having this kind of defunding of government itself, at the same time that you're having this tremendous swell of, at this point, unlimited funds available for the actual election of the people's representatives, which, are those of us who are elected. Could you talk a little bit about how that plays and how it also feeds that revolving door structure that you're underpaid as a regulator, and you know that when you get out, you can triple your income? So if you could just address how those two interplay.
That's a lot. Well, let me start with a thought. The amount of money and economic loss that this last crisis is more than it would cost for the regulators to do their job. Yeah, agencies are defunded. It's politics. I think a lot of politicians don't run for re-election because they get so disgusted with the system, and I think a lot of regulators do too. I can tell you a story where one time I was in a committee hearing, and I was looking at a bill, and I said, "Where'd this language come from?" And it came from a lobbyist. I mean, it's very common. It's very common, and that happens in Washington too. I really don't know how to address your question, because not only do we need a healthy regulatory system, and we need to support that, but oftentimes we have no regulation. I mean, let me give you an example. In 1999, there was an effort by some regulators. Brooksley Bourne is a name that comes to mind, who said, we need to control this derivatives market. And several of the individuals who were against that, and I won't get into the names, but they left government and wanted really good jobs, really well-paying jobs. Brooksley was right. Had we not too much regulated, we just regulated a little bit, we would have probably avoided a lot of the problems we had in 2007-8. In New Hampshire, one of the things I actually brought my book, hawking my book. One of the things I talk about is FRM happened because, not because there's too much regulation or too little, there's no regulation in many financial products we offer in the state. No regulation. So here's a sad fact. We had the two largest Ponzi schemes in New Hampshire's history happen within 1 year of each other. $50+ million was lost to several hundred New Hampshire citizens. Think about that. Now, let's not do the blame game or talk why it happened. One of the things I go and I talk about, part of the cover-up, is nothing's happened, meaning none of the laws have changed. Commercial mortgages today are still unregulated investments or instruments. And let me tell you how scary that is. People say, oh, you know, Mark, we don't want regulation. We're deregulated. We're a regulatory friendly state, and that's what we want to be. I've heard that a lot. Okay, let's assume for a minute we don't want to regulate commercial mortgages by the big banks. The person who perpetrated FRM, he was able to say to the banking department, I'm not showing you those documents because those are commercial mortgages, and New Hampshire doesn't regulate commercial mortgages. And the banking department knew the guy had no capital, knew they had 70 violations of state and federal law. So the point is, yes, we've had several individuals leave the regulatory process and the revolving door, but the system is so out of control at the federal and state level that the industry is able basically to say no regulation in some instances. One of the things I went out when I was in the department and I brought in legislation to have some regulation of securities. That was a battle royale. One of the things I said was, okay, I know for a fact there are instruments today that are being sold to New Hampshire citizens, there's no regulation. And the industry gets to the legislators. And that's the problem. So what do? We do regulation after the fact. We do rear view mirror regulation. So if you go Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, and Dodd-Frank, they were addressing problems that happened here. And ironically enough, and you go back in financial history, the same scheme doesn't repeat itself. It's always something else. But the common denominator is greed and lack of regulatory will. So that's really the problem. And unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the tools are still in place for the kind of blow up that we just experienced to happen again. And I'm not trying to be a doom and gloomer. I think the system is better today in general than it was in 2007-8, but the force is still at play. And if we're to bring our democracy back, if we're to bring, see, I'm saying the message today is not only democracy, but financial stability. If we don't do this, we will continue along the Wild West example of a fistful of dollars. So it's a very hard equation. We need also, and one of the things I mentioned in my book, the best regulators, I think, are the ones who don't need it. Because what happens is if somebody becomes a career bureaucrat and they get that title and they get that picture of themselves on the wall, they don't want to lose that. And $100,000 or $125,000 is a lot of money, but to them, that's it, and they'll do whatever it takes not to lose that job. And the way the system works, they're afraid of political blowback. I mean, I got to tell you, and not to go into great detail, I felt threatened a couple of times on Tyco being one of them. And I had nothing to lose because I wasn't trying to be a career regulator. So what can we do? One of the things you could say is don't get your ticket punched. Just like if you're a senator or congressman. If you're a regulator, you have a cooling off period too. Now, whether that's 5 years, 3 years, I don't know. But you shouldn't be able to walk out on one day from a major case and actually, and I kid you not, it happens, go work for that company you just took action on. Sir?
Me, I'm Greg Warner. I've been involved in politics for, not involved, just an observer. Well, I'd like to summarize your speech. We have the best government money can buy, and it owns it. One of the great frustrations as someone who has, among other things, been a regulator, but not on an executive level, I'm just a grunt doing the work, is there's nothing you can do about it. what we have running this country is that magic combination of super ego, I am the king of the world, unlimited greed, and an addiction to gambling. I don't know what we're going to do about it. I'd like to know. But how do you get regulators that stay honest? You know, I'm making $100,000 a year as a federal financial regulator, and some guy offers me $1.5 million. I mean, it takes a saint not to say yes. Nobody ever offered me, so I can. I'm. But I'd have to really think about it. And you know, how much do we have to spend to get one Democrat elected to our House of Representatives? When we got a House of Representatives that's as big as the U.S. House. Come on, folks. And we had a conversation going in the back here on some land up by our airport. The Tamposi family's been sitting on it since at least 30 or 40 years now. And I'm surprised they've let go. And we're getting people that are objecting to it. Well, it's a damned airport. That's by its very, very nature an environmental degradation. So you might as well complete the job and put a FedEx warehouse up there. I'm rambling. I'm sorry I'm rambling, but my real problem, and I've debated this a fair amount online, is we do have the best government money can buy, and it owns it. But the trouble is the people that own it are not honorable businessmen. They're con men and thieves. And when the con men are running the show, what the hell do you do? Among all others, where the hell do people like us put our money? Thank you for my rant.
No, no, no.
But I gotta do it once in a while.
Actually, I do have a comment, if I may. It's not all that doom and gloom, because when you go back in American history, we've gone through many periods, worse than it is now, believe it or not, where money was, there are examples, for example, I think, I don't give the wrong state, where companies were assessed a certain amount of money to support certain candidates. Or back in the early 1800s, there was we had a system where if you got a job in the federal government, you had to give part of your salary to politicians. So what happens is when it really gets bad, Americans usually wake up and we rein it back in. And that's what we're hoping for right now. We're hoping there are honest people in America, there are good business leaders, there are good government leaders, and we need to, I guess what I'm trying to say, the story is us here. You know, you remember the pogo, I met the enemy's us? Well, we have to own this. We have to keep these politicians in line. And I think if 16 states have said we don't like Citizens United, that's a message and a wake-up call. So I hear what you're saying, but I'm still optimistic that we can do something.
And probably one of the biggest examples of it. One of the biggest examples of in history was the election of Teddy Roosevelt, where Rockefeller and was putting so much money into the other candidate. They were trying to buy the candidate through buying all the other votes. And eventually it got back around, and Teddy Roosevelt eventually did win. So, I'm surprised that isn't one of the bigger examples. I know History Channel has done a big markup on that.
The funny thing about Teddy Roosevelt, which he did start a lot of what's become the populist movement, he was so concerned that he would not win his first election after the assassination of William McKinley, that he actually solicited the money from corporations, and he was so disgusted by it. After he got elected, and maybe that's what it takes in this country, somebody who actually has to go through the system once they get to the position to do something. Teddy Roosevelt did it, and he started a lot of that movement to really put in place getting corporate money and labor money out of the election. So we've been through this cycle before. The problem is the stakes are so much higher because the economy is so much bigger and connected. I probably mentioned this, but if you go back, These banks are now so big, we really have codified too big to fail. And we have to really get this regulatory scheme right, because we can't go down this path again.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things that he did was he broke apart all the monopolies. I mean, some people might not say that what we have now are monopolies, but they're pretty much on the verge of monopolies for a lot of these companies. And how much wealth they're controlling themselves is pretty controlling. I don't know if that's another way that the country needs to eventually attack it, but, I mean,
That's a whole different subject, I think.
exactly.
But thank you.
How you doing, Mark?
Hi.
We've heard a bunch of arguments both ways. You hear the one side, people can give whatever they want, but just disclose it. Then you hear the other argument, there should be a limit on what you're allowed to give. And then other people say it should be publicly funded. It kind of seems like a little bit, the medium size, and the full boat, on controlling it. Which one or a combination of those do you think would work the best, or which one do you think it's going to have to transition to? Because some people I've heard say that even if you let people give unlimited amounts, but they have to disclose, American population is not stupid. They'll realize real quickly if they're being manipulated. So nobody even wants to put a disclosure with an unlimited amount, because the American population, they will figure it out, and eventually they'll shut them down anyway. So it's, and they call it freedom of speech, to be able to spend your money how you want, but it's not really freedom if you're hiding behind something and not disclosing it. So which one of those three do you think, or a combination of it, would even solve the problem?
Well, my quick answer is, first of all, I think disclosure is something we should all be able to agree on. So that's kind of the easy hanging fruit. So that's kind of why I highlight that. In terms of, if we get to that point, in terms of people still being able to give outsized amount of money, I think personally that we need to control that. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think a corporation is a person for the sake of giving money. And corporations don't vote. We do. So so I think getting to disclosure and getting a limit on those kinds of money is basically what people are so disgusted by since Citizens United was passed by the Supreme Court, or overruled, I should say. As far as publicly funding of campaigns, there are so many different ways to do it. And there's a lot of debate about it. I don't think we are there yet as voters. I think we're going to evolve into it. I mean, consider this. We have how many state reps and state house representatives and state senators and county commissioners? Every 2 years, they're calling every one of us for money. And, at some point, the system breaks. Getting to some kind of system where, for example, people can raise a certain amount of money and then have it matched, and then we try and do that kind of system. You have to be a legitimate candidate. Some states have tried it with various results. I think that kind of debate is down the road as a country, what we're going to do. I think, and that was the whole purpose of maybe having us together as Republicans and Democrats. We should be able to at least start down that road of disclosure. When we get that and we identify getting the money out to the degree it's pervading the system, then we need a discussion about how that all comes together in a different kind of scheme than we are doing now. Where that goes, it's a really different debate than I think you want to get into tonight.
Yeah, he hasn't asked a question. You, Charlie, you're gonna have. Nice try, Charlie.
Hi, Mark. I'm
Hi.
Oscar Mark. How you doing?
How are you?
Good, thanks. It seems to me that the areas you've covered seem to be obvious areas for a lot of bipartisan cooperation. I have trouble imagining that you don't have a broad spectrum of cooperation around issues like this. So I guess my question is, it is frustrating to hear about it, but my question is, what are the primary impediments that you see today that prevents these, what I consider common sense solutions from moving forward? I know the money is very enticing, and it's difficult to move the money out, but it seems to me that there's such a need for this, for these solutions, that you'd see more of a groundswell of support for these, and yet you don't see it. I don't know if it's because it's not sexy in some way, that it's too complicated. It doesn't really grab the attention of people or what, but you'd think after financial meltdowns and the variety of different things you've seen with fraud and election scenarios that take place with all the money pouring in, that people would just really rally behind something like this. And yet we still seem to be kind of stuck and mired in a situation that really seems to be not moving the way it ought to.
Terry, my fiance, tells me I sometimes use movie analogies too much when I talk, but I
haven't heard them. Scott, go ahead.
but the one that comes to mind is, and this I hope gets to your point, the movie Network, where the one of the gentlemen he says, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it any longer. So the point is, it's human nature. We're never going to really change human nature, okay? But we can put in rules of the road that doesn't allow these kind of excesses to happen. I don't think there's a formula. You put in the key in and you unlock the door. I really think it's these kind of dialogues and putting the pressure on those who run for office. And that's why, the Citizens Rebellion, hundreds of people march, more will march, hopefully in July 5th, and hopefully you guys, some of you can come out. It's that kind of media attention. Justice Brandeis, one of the best Supreme Court justices ever served, in my opinion, he said the way to have change in our system is with maximum media attention. That's the way we do it. We need to get out and put politicians on the line that the American public doesn't want this anymore. And I think having 16 states say we want to overturn Citizens United is a very powerful statement. I think it's doable. I really do. But it's going to be a hard-fought fight. But to your point, it's so obvious we need to do this as a country. And that's why we need, as Republicans and Democrats, to work on this together. Because the reason we had the sequester and the reason why, the government has really, in some instances, shut down to the point where we have 8% favorability for Congress, is because the money is meant to drive us apart. Because the more the money drives us apart, the more they raise. And that's the whole cycle. So when you go to whoever, Republican, Democrat, is your selection, ask them where they are on this issue. Ask them what they have done on this issue. I think that's the way we have to address it. There's no magic formula. It's really up to us. That's what Benjamin Franklin was saying to us, 250 years ago, whatever it was. But anyway.
So we have, I don't have all of the data unless it's written down here somewhere. But our Congresswoman Carol Shea Porter has never accepted super PAC money. She has relied on donations from New Hampshire citizens. So it is almost shocking in this environment, when we're talking about the kinds of money that can be leveraged in these campaigns, that we have elected a person who's following the high road. And yet, because of the quality of her service to the people of New Hampshire and for this district, she's able to do that. I certainly know that Jean Shaheen accepts super PAC money and has probably done so for a long time. I was an unpaid lobbyist while she was in the Senate, and the joke was we never spoke because we always agreed. But she's gone on to do great things in the Senate now, and I think is showing that same bipartisan thing. But so we have a mix in the Kelly Ayotte's campaign. I can't speak for my.
I'd like to speak on that, if you don't mind, also.
Speak to the light, come to the mic. Speak up, yeah, put your shoes on.
Honories. I do know that Carol does take PAC money. I just want to, she takes union money. And that's a big issue here with a lot of people when it comes to this, the whole New Hampshire Rebellion and taking money from Citizens United. It's important to understand that there is that ongoing debate with union money. I'm sure you could probably, speak better to that than I can. My opinion, I come from a union dad, union family, so I see it differently on a personal level, because for me, I know that my dad took union money because he knew who he was supporting as a union. If he had to give money to two people, you know, I'm sorry to reference them, Koch brothers, he may not do that. He may not be sure if he wants to give money to two people. So that's kind of how I distinguish that. Then that's just me, my personal opinion. I do know that Carol takes union money, and that's the first time, I think, in this last 2 years that she's done that. Of course, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think there's a state official. I ran for state rep. I ran for state senate. I took union money because those are the people that I knew supported me from a family perspective. So when you want to talk about the union part of it, and you want to, you know, Sharon Carson takes PAC money, tobacco money, all of this stuff, we're going to have to decide how we're going to regulate that. And that's what you're talking about. That's how you play into that whole debate. And I don't know that every single candidate is ever going to say they're never going to do it, or they're going to sign these pledges, because, as you stated so eloquently, it's a revolving door in our state house. It's a revolving door in our government. You know, no one has talked about tonight about Cantor. I guarantee you, when he lost that primary, as you said, he had a revolving door straight to a lobbyist. There's no doubt in my mind. If it isn't there today, it's coming. So those things that's my thoughts on the matter.
No, I hear you, and I hear, let me put my I'll put my Democratic hat on for a minute. The disclosure, the disclosure bills put before Congress in the last 4 years have been Democrats, and the Republicans have voted against it. Yes, we have union money, and we have corporate money, but if you go back to the 2012 election, the unions are outspent 2-1. Lawrence Lessig, who's kind of the spearhead between the New Hampshire Rebellion, and he spent a lot of time on the issue like public financing campaigns, et cetera. What he's doing right now is raising a lot of money to say in 2016, we're going to now put our attention on selective race in the country to show we can elect people without going to special interest money. And he has said, you know, if you say you're only going to take a certain amount of money, you will be drowned out. But what we really want are to go to candidates and say, will you, if elected, support to get the special interest money out? That's the key question.
Special interest, by that definition in your sentence, includes unions or not? I'm saying yes. I think that, I'm not saying unions and corporations are the same. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that corporations are different. I'm saying there should be some control of how monies come in, but I'm drawing distinction to corporation and union. Union is dues given by actual workers. Corporations are different. No,
And
you just said special interest money out, and I'm just asking you to clarify.
oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
When you say special interest, are you including unions or not?
I'm not. I'm not including special interests in the terms of this context of discussion. I misspoke. It's a different funding in terms of corporate money. But what I'm saying is that I do think there should be disclosure, and I do think we need to somehow figure out a way not to have unlimited amounts of money. There should be some way of attacking that. And there's a lot of discussion about how to do it. But no, I'm not putting a union and a corporation in the same analysis. I didn't mean to do that. The monies, in my opinion, come from it. Are all unions incorporated? I can't say they all are incorporated, but well, anyway, we probably differ on that subject. I said I can't say all unions or corporations. I don't know the answer to that. You know, I think my whole purpose in meeting with you all was to speak to Democrats, and it became to speak to Democrats and Republicans. And I respectfully, you know, let me read you another quote that I actually wrote down that I didn't read to you. Different men, we use men and women. This was by Patrick Henry.
different men often see the same subject in a different light. We can sit here and talk about how we may differ in terms of where this conversation go. And I'm willing to do that. And I do draw a distinction in terms of corporate money versus union money. But I do think the reason we're here is to do what Benjamin Franklin said, that we need to somehow find common ground to move the ball forward. And I think we all can agree that lack of disclosure, the amount of money pouring, and it's growing exponential, it just drives us apart and we're not getting anywhere. And my message as a financial guy is we're hurting our economy. We're hurting ourselves. And that obviously is, what they say, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is definition of insanity. And that's where we're at. The system's become insane.
Okay. My name's Kate. I'm running for state senate, and I have nowhere near the money that you were talking about before. Do you think it's possible for someone to win an election, any election, without donations from either union or corporations?
Yes.
Do you really?
Yes. And I'll tell you how you do it. Yes.
That's encouraging.
And the way you do it is you do what we're doing tonight. You go door to door. And because politics, as Tip O'Neill said, it's all personal. And if you can connect with people and they get a feeling about you as a person, that you're honest and you're going to represent them, that overcomes money.
Even against Koch brothers and media?
A state rep, state senate,
Yes.
a state rep or state senate race, I think it's possible.
I do it.
A congressional race,
Yeah, I've never spent a cent. I spent, first time I ran, I spent $19 for a thank you ad. And since then, I learned you can write a letter to the editor. And I didn't spend any money.
And did you accept it from unions and?
No, the union offered me money last time. I said, save it.
Or,
And turn it over to somebody.
or corporations? We need this in the press. We need an article on
It's
this.
not, I don't think it's, well, it's become unusual in the last 6 or 8 years. But before that, I've never had a sign, nothing. I don't even put one on my car. But it can be done, but he's right, you have to go to meetings, know your neighbors. You know, I really campaigned 2 years for the election. In other words, I go to the meetings, I don't.
Thank you.
You know,
go for it.
Good,
yeah.
good, cool.
Join a club.
Last question. Last question.
So Betsy was just saying that she doesn't need to raise money, and she doesn't even put her signs up, but that's because we all know her. I was at a forum on Wednesday, and the keynote speaker was Judd Gregg, and the discussion was on the impact of national debt on New Hampshire politics. And at a certain part of the discussion, Senator Gregg discussed what he called a highly dysfunctional Congress. And he was relating it to the fact that factions have taken over the political system, and that polarization has just basically frozen the Congress in place. And Governor Ed Rendell was the other speaker, and he stood up and encouraged politicians to be courageous. And so I took the microphone and I said, I'm a Democrat, but I right now would like to speak on behalf of my moderate Republican friends, and I've had many over the years. I said, you're telling these people to be courageous, but they know if they take one single vote, and there's a person in this room who had money come at her because she took one vote in the wrong direction, and they get primaried, they get targeted. There was a massive download of out-of-state money. And I think anyone who's worked on a town committee or has been elected to anything knows that the people on the far right aren't going to help you when it comes to solution, and neither are the people on the far left. It's those people in the middle who are willing to sit down at the table and discuss solutions that are going to come up with the best answers for the state of New Hampshire and for the town of Londonderry, and certainly for the country. So we have a system now where we need moderate solutions, we need that common sense middle road, but we have a system in place that punishes those Republicans who want to come to the middle, who want to come to those solutions. Could you address that part of the issue, please? Thank you.
Sure, Lisa. Actually, since the last question, and I do have an opinion about this that may surprise some of you. I actually was a Republican at one time. I was a state rep from the town of Bedford a long time ago. And in fact, I was I think 21 years old. When I look back at that period in 1976, 77, there were a lot of moderates in the Republican Party. And there were a lot of moderates Republican moderates in Washington. And we can go through the list of those names. The party's different today, and I think a lot of it's because of the money that we're talking about. And that's why I'm a Democrat. I think if you're a pragmatic person and you're moderate, I personally speaking, I just don't see the party going in that direction in a way that's conducive to what we're trying to accomplish and have. What Benjamin Franklin said is, in order for us to have a republic, we have to respect other voices and realize that my opinion may be sounding good to me, but in order to move the ball forward, we have to work together and come up with common solutions. So the problem is this money is dividing and putting the candidates out, especially in the Republican Party, particularly the Republican Party, on the fringe. And I think it's unfortunate. And we need to the Republican Party would do itself a favor in the United States if it recognized that the solutions of the Koch brothers is wrong, and it's driving us in a direction that's not constructive. So, thank you.
Yes, I was just gonna mention that. I encourage you to,
Yeah, Tim, talk to the microphone, there's one right there.
I would encourage you guys to read Mark's book. Honestly, it's about inside government in New Hampshire. It gives you a really broad perspective of a guy who I've come to know, with your and my speaking, that we're on the same page in a lot of things. And I think that, you know, it's important to understand it's not one person's state, it's everybody's state. And we all have to work together to come to that conclusion. And I encourage you to read his book. Absolutely.
I'm happy to sign editions.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.